Thank you so much for coming in today. I want to make it worth your while. I hope it will be anyway, to go through an actual study. So I'm going to take the time to break down some of the components of a carb versus fat type study. And I mentioned yesterday that I personally think the best researcher in the game right now when it comes to researching diet methodology is Kevin Hall, who has a directorship position in the NIH. He does, as far as I know, manages, directs all of the nutrition research at the National Institutes of Health. And I came across him, gosh, a long, long time ago. He must have been super early in his career because I remember seeing his name a long time ago. But it seems like he has really just built some momentum to be almost a catalyst for this one particular issue. Is a low fat or low carb diet better? And he's even gotten into some scuffles academically with different people, and some people have published like response papers against him, which he has to respond to. So there's this interesting little bit of flair, kind of drama, almost like Fauci versus Trump, on the White House stage there. And so it's kind of fun to see him have to restrain himself from being too snarky and making some of these responses, but he lets the research lead for him. He consistently, as soon as he sees or hears kind of a mythology being created and disseminated, he'll simply conduct a study to investigate it. And he's incredibly fair. And I'm going to even go through in the study that I'm going to comb through today. I'm going to even tell you some of the things that I think could be done in addition to it. One of the things that any scientist should do at the end of reviewing a study is look for, quote, flaws. And those aren't necessarily fatal flaws or critiques that negate the entire study. But oftentimes the own researchers, the researchers of their own study will often say, here's what we found, but we didn't really have time to look at this, or this made us think that maybe this would have been a better way to design the study. And so next time, somebody who wants to replicate this might do it this way. So there's even some self-deprecation involved when the pursuit is literal truth. As long as you're not so overcome by confirmation bias that you just want to go out there and punch people in the face with your bias, then there's always a certain level of humility. And Kevin Hall is one of those guys I really respect in that vein. So here's what he did. This particular study was in response to a growing surge of interest where ketogenic proponents were saying, hey, if you do a low carb, high fat diet, it is better metabolically. It will, especially from an endocrine system perspective, all of the hormones involved are better served and more active in your favor if you do a low carb diet. So Kevin Hall says, all right, challenge accepted. Let's see. And so in 2015, he did a study, and it was published in Cell Metabolism. And when he looked at this, one of the things he wanted to do, of course, because this is his MO at this point, he's one of these researchers who knows the difference, as I discussed yesterday, between a self-reported study and an inpatient study. And I think even though there is some value, even down to case studies and anecdotal observation and perhaps even survey studies. I'm getting ready, hopefully, to engage in a series of survey studies. You can gather a lot of information that points you in good directions. But when you want to really study something, it has to be in a lab, epidemiologically, looking at massive control of all the variables. So what better way in a nutrition study to do that than locking people up and only allowing them to eat what you feed them? It's truly the only way to get a real answer. So he looked at some of these assertions by the ketogenic proponents, and of course, their studies were all just self-reporting. And we talked about yesterday how that is incredibly flawed, because self-reported studies have an average of about 30% unreliability, actually underreporting. So if you're part of a study, you're a subject and you're in the study, you're supposed to be on a low fat or low carb diet, and they tell you what to eat, or maybe they even give you the food to eat, and they say, now be a good boy, be a good girl, only eat this. Then you come back in every week to do your body comp analysis or surveys, and you.
San Antonio's pretty bad.
Hey Bernie. Bernie Dodd. We got your audio on, Bernie.
I think as host, Joe, you may be able to
okay.
mute it force it onto her.
Thanks, Kevin. I forgot about that. All right. Yeah, a little mistake, butt dial kind of thing happens all the time. But so when you're looking at these kind of studies, you really want to compare them. If one study says one thing and another study says something else, you really have to look at the methodology first. That's something really to dig into. So Dr. Hall immediately says, okay, we're gonna look at which type of diet, a low carb or low fat diet, is better metabolically, how this impacts the hormonal base, and even just obviously which is better at losing body fat. So we're gonna take subjects and put them in a metabolic ward. And as I mentioned yesterday, you can't do this for 6 months. You can't do it with 1 million subjects, when you're paying somebody full time to do a study. If you guys have ever been paid for a study, it's really interesting. When I was at the IU med school, it's actually a great way to make some extra money. There's always somebody doing studies. So like the dental school, the physical therapy school, the med school, they're always just paying students, a little bit of money to be involved in a certain study. And so what Kevin Hall did was he took 19 subjects, 9 women, 10 men. They were an average of about 35 years old. They had an average BMI of around 40, which is, I think the women were, probably around maybe 37, 38. The men were around 41, 42. So poundage wise, these, average age 35-year-old people, almost 20 of them were, anywhere between, 200 pounds and about 240, 250 pounds, male and female. So they were classified as obese. And they put them in a metabolic ward for two-week periods. So you would come in, you would report for this study, and they immediately gave everybody a metabolic cart test in a metabolic chamber. So they ascertain everybody's exact metabolic rates. And they give you a maintenance level calorie diet for whatever you needed for 5 days. They did a traditional USDA type diet. So about 50% carbs, 35% fat, 15% protein, and gave them that for 5 days as kind of a washout mechanism. So, everybody has a physiological stable base to begin. Then they would do a week long, you were in one group or the other, high carb or high fat diet for 6 days. And they would take these measurements. Then you got to go home, for a couple of weeks and get kind of another little washout period. Then you came back to repeat that, only this time in reverse. So every single subject gets to be both in the high carb and the high fat, or low carb, low fat, depending on how you look at it, study groups. So you're not just even having to deal with, who knows how many superstar metabolic people were over here. Or maybe they had, a lot of people in this study group that were younger and more athletic and all these things. Again, Kevin Hall, I love this guy for this reason. He really takes out a lot of design flaws right from the beginning. So they go through all of this work. And as I mentioned, when you're doing inpatient studies, you're going to really be restricted by how long you can keep people. So it was these two-week block intervals. And then you have to do some statistic modeling, because you look at what happens in those 6 days. And this is one of those design quote flaws or critiques where you say, well, if this happens in the first 6 days, do we really know what happens in the second 6 days and maybe the 40th, week and so forth? those things take other studies to confirm. And so even at the end of this particular study in Cell Metabolism, they said, here's a list of 20 studies that also concluded the same things, and these other 30 studies that concluded the same things, and out of those 30 or so studies we looked at to try and confirm results, 2 of them actually showed something else. So they're intellectually honest enough to say, here is exactly what we see in every other study. So almost every time you do even one piece of research, there's almost a feel of a literature review. You have to, you don't just put this out there in a vacuum. You're putting it in the context of other research that's already been done. So a particular study like this is probably 20 or so pages just to kind of slog through what was published, let alone how much longer the actual, notes and so forth would have been. So with all of that said, oh, by the way, they also did, let me tell you about the calorie intake. They also wanted them to be somewhat active, just kind of replicating real life. So they had them do an hour of treadmill activity, every day, obviously with people who are mostly sedentary and overweight. They weren't running sprints or doing intervals, but, they were moderately active, just so there's some metabolic activity. And when I tell you that they kind of baselined out everybody's their washout diet just to get them ready, and they did the metabolic cart testing for that. The average person, and this is really of interest to me, the average person between almost half men and half women, just their basal metabolic rate was just over 2,700 calories. So remember I told you that when we're heavier, that load on our muscular system and our heart and lungs, like you'll never, quote, need more calories than when you are heavier. So a lot of people think, man, when I just lose 40 pounds or 60 pounds, I'm going to be able to eat so much because my metabolism is going to be amazing. Your metabolism is way higher. The heavier you are, the more out of shape you are because of that physical load. But again, it's all relative. We won't get into that today. We've covered that topic many, many times. But 2,700 calories as a basal metabolic rate as an average among 20 subjects. That was one of those reminders of that principle to me. So what they did was they said, okay, that's everybody's baseline. Now let's cut it by 30%. So, reducing calories by 30% seems like a lot. I mean, to me anyway, as a nutrition consultant. But when you do that math, the average person was still eating over 1,900 calories a day. That's not bad. That is not bad at all. And the way they divided the low carb and the low fat group up, since they were still using, I wouldn't even say the RDA level of food, or protein, it's very close, but the average person was still consuming about 100 grams of protein a day. And for male or female, who's not a competitive Olympic athlete or something like that, like that's a good amount. That's an amount any general population person could strive for, and be well served with the amount of protein you're consuming. So for the low carb group, this is another, I wouldn't say it's a critique of mine, but you have to put these variables someplace. You have to decide why you're going to do it a certain way, and you're justifying that, based again on the context of your research and what you want to investigate. But for the low carb group, they put their carbs at what was it, like 140 grams. And so they were going by a percentage, and that still allowed them to have 100 plus grams of fat, 108 grams of fat. So 100 or so grams of protein, 108 grams of fat, and carbs around 140. That almost to me sounds it's obviously lower carb. I would never have somebody's fat as a suggestion from me at 108. But you could, if you really wanted to test a ketogenic diet, you could have been way down. So keep that in mind. This was a low carb diet. I mean, by design, the medical definition of a low carb diet, but it was not a ketogenic diet. So then for the low fat group, they put them down all the way to an average of 17 grams of fat. So I wasn't thrilled with the fact that they left the low carb group still at kind of a moderate level of carbs. And then they took the low fat group and they put them way down low. I mean, 17 grams of fat, that for a day, that is very difficult. But they had 350 grams of carbs. So this would really be classified as a high carb diet. But again, everybody, based on their own basal metabolic rate, with an exact 30% restriction in calories, went through this process. So the final results, here's the drum roll. In 6 days, and with Dexa scanning, so you're really looking at true fat loss and lean body mass, that kind of thing. You're not conflating water loss or hydration changes, that kind of thing. It's a pure Dexa scan. The low carb group, so the high fat group, they lost half a pound, just over half a pound of fat in 6 days. The low fat group doubled that. They lost over a pound. So when you get into statistical analysis and mathematical modeling, you have to say, okay, not only was it a doubling, so in 1 month or 6 months, you wouldn't just see a doubling. You have to see how far that's skewing out to see what that difference could be in 6 months or a year or something like that. But just for the base of this particular study, think of the fact that on the same amount of calories, an isocaloric diet study designed exactly for your specific metabolism, and the fact that you as a subject, you got to test both with complete washouts and baseline diets prior, again, the greatest variable control you could have. And then, you're losing twice as much body fat, twice as much on the same amount of calories, just by making sure that your fat intake was lower. So that's the first little bit of information. The second is, well, what about these assertions that it's better for your hormonal environment? So they tested serum hormone levels like insulin, and they showed that the low carb group, so the higher fat low carb group, certainly had substantial decreases in circulating insulin. And this is supposed to be a huge goal, right? This is actually called the insulin theory of fat loss. And a lot of people made this popular, like the zone diet and even Dr. Atkins, where, man, it's all about controlling insulin. If you just get insulin down, that's the key. The whole ball of wax is just getting insulin down. There's even a journalist out there, Gary Taubes, again, absolutely no training in nutrition, zero, but he's a journalist. And he got a name and started making money by writing books on nutrition. And he happened to fall in love with ketogenic dieting. So he's out there writing books, creating marketing hype, and he's a big proponent of saying it's all about insulin. Carbs are fattening. Well, here's a study, inpatient study, metabolic ward, showing that even with insulin being dramatically reduced, you still had the higher insulin level group lose twice as much body fat. So it's not all about insulin. Insulin is an important variable, but it's not all about insulin. It's about total calories. It's about total fat. And it's about the law that, the first law of thermodynamics, just how much energy you're taking in versus expending. It's not about, there's nothing magic about reducing carbs as an insulin driving mechanism. It's just not. So here's another interesting thing that's a little bit of a myth. You would say, well, if I'm a ketogenic proponent, if I really want to convince people that you've got to be on a low carb diet, I would say, man, when you are in a low carb diet, fat oxidation goes through the roof, meaning your body's use of fat as energy skyrockets. And that was proven here. Fat oxidation in the low carb group did skyrocket because that's all you have to use as energy. You're using such little carbs. It's not all body fat. It's all the fat in your diet. You're becoming more efficient. We've covered this as well in our chats. You're becoming more efficient at using fat as energy, which is great, but that doesn't mean you're using more calories. And so he took two of the biggest nails you could to put in the coffin of ketogenic dieting proponents, saying that their methodology is better. So again, once you extrapolate this out over time and you start running that data, it just becomes increasingly true that a lower fat diet is better because of one more nail. The third nail in this coffin is the fact that in just 6 days, while the low fat group, even on a 30% calorie restricted diet, their metabolism didn't change whatsoever. Their metabolic capacity didn't change. Guess what happened to the low carb group? Theirs fell by almost 100 calories. If in the very first week of calorie restriction, your metabolism is already falling that fast, what do you think happens at week 10 or 12 or 20? So, I set this whole talk up yesterday by going through some of these categories that we would want to know. I mean, if we're going to be good students of nutrition, just people using this information to try and live our best, healthiest lives, these are things we want to know. What's best for my metabolism? A low fat diet. What's best for losing body fat to the tune of twice as fast? A low fat diet. Isocalorically assumed, I'm talking about having the exact same amount of calories. What's going to be best for sustainability? That wasn't covered in this study, but they certainly discussed it because of having to extrapolate out those mathematical models. You have to make certain assumptions for sustainability and who's going to be able to follow this. And we know through a lot of other research studies that low carb diets are the least sustainable. They are the ones that lead to the most binge eating, the most eating disorders, and they have the lowest sustainability. So again, and that's ketogenic. If you did just a low carb diet, as this study was, then I think compliance is a little bit better. If you try to tell me I can have 0 grams of carbs versus I can have 140 grams of carbs, that's a world of difference. I mean, 140 grams of carbs is way more sustainable than just never having any. So that's where I would say that this particular study was even generous. I mean, they showed these results and those people still had a pretty good amount of carb intake. If you drop them down to nothing, the metabolism drop probably would have been a lot worse. Certainly there would have been more fat, oxidation, which you would expect because you have to rely on more fat. You're actually consuming more fat. But with all that said, I would also kind of include that one final category that wasn't addressed here, which is lean body mass and even hormones like testosterone, because that's another place that people tend to say, well, if you have a high fat diet, you got to have that steak, man, you got to have that beef, that fat to increase or maintain testosterone. And again, the long-term studies on this show just the opposite. The more difference level you have between fat intake and just carbs, if you're going to try and reproduce this particular type of study, the higher your fat, the lower your testosterone goes. And you could also say that if you are just in a hypocaloric diet for too long, testosterone is also going to go down. So I don't want you to think that just eating carbs prevents that. That has a lot more to do with just your dieting status as well as your body composition. So no matter how you diet, pick either camp. If you're down to 3 or 4% body fat, your testosterone is going to drop, even if you did everything the right way. If you've dieted for an entire year and you weren't careful to take breaks and so forth, your hormonal panel is also going to be depreciated quite a bit. And that's why it's important to take some of those diet breaks and make sure you're dieting at a healthy pace. But all of that on the table for discussion. Do you guys have any questions? Even some of our guests, I appreciate you guys jumping in here to talk about this and listen. But if you have any questions about your own personal journey in body composition management, weight loss, performance, certainly I would love to talk about those. We got quite a bit of time left. Anybody reaching? There you go, Steve.
Hey, I missed half of what you talked about. I had a call. We got the tail end. Quick question, easy answer. Fat in the blood will you use any stored fat when there's fat in the blood? Or if fat use is the simplest to use from bloodstream, so it won't extract from cells.
It's a percent basis, Steve. So the question is, any lipids in your bloodstream, will those prevent you from using stored body fat? And just even looking at this study as an example, these people were still consuming, or I should not say still, but they were consuming 108 grams of fat per day, and they still lost half a pound of body fat. But the other group with only 17 grams of fat intake per day, they lost twice as much. So you can see that there was 100% increase in fat mobilization from stored body fat cells versus what's in the bloodstream. So any fat in your diet, I mean, you're always going to maintain some levels of lipids in your bloodstream. But again, it's a percent basis. When you have less to draw from, then your body's going to get that from your stored body fat cells. Somebody asked a question here, Amanda. What kind of scans were used? They would be. I think you're asking about Dexa scans. Oh, okay. Kevin said that as well. So yeah, that's the 99.9% accurate. It's literally using low frequency X-rays so that you're looking at the exact kind of tissue. They did measure metabolic rate after the diet, yes, and the people who were on the low fat diet, higher carbs, their metabolic rates stayed the exact same. So after 6 days, no change. The other group dropped by almost 100 calories. So if you did the math on that, out of an almost 2,000 calorie a day diet, 100 calories, that would be. It's a low percent. I should actually do that math here. So you're looking at, is that a 5% change or so? That quickly, maybe it's only a 0.05% change, but it's showing a substantial trend, at least in that direction, from these people having 0 hits to their metabolism with having a higher carb diet, and these people dropping already by almost 100 calories a day. So again, if you show that statistically out in the distance, that's only going to continue happening, which it does. There are other, many other longitudinal studies that have shown that the metabolism does, almost linearly continue to drop when you're in that type of ketogenic type diet. And, just as a little anecdotal story, as a pro competitive bodybuilder for 20 years and, my own academic pursuits in nutrition, I have done everything. I have tested everything in my own body, from long stints of vegetarianism to ketogenic dieting. And there were 2 periods of my life that I did ketogenic dieting exactly how it's supposed to be. One time it just wrecked my GI system for life. That's why, GI function is a kind of a hobby horse of mine. But both times, I, as a competitive bodybuilder, using this as part of my prep for a contest, I never achieved the body fat composition that I needed. I never got lean enough on a ketogenic diet, but I lost so much muscle. I lost so much size that by the time I got to those contests, it was just a total fail. I looked at myself compared to other seasons, and I just thought, what in the fuck happened? Like, I did everything like you're supposed to. These quote experts were telling me, and this was even before I had done my first doctorate in nutrition. I was just a hungry consumer trying to figure all this out, consumer of information. And it was unbelievable how not only badly it felt. I mean, if you've gone on a ketogenic diet for 4 or 5 or 6 months, you're suffering, 0 energy for training. And yet I lost so much muscle, lost so much strength, did not lose the amount of body fat I should have, paid a horrible price with my health. And I replicated the study twice because I thought, well, maybe I did something wrong the first time, so let's try it again. And, same result. And these are the kind of things I see with my own clients. I have a lot of clients who come to me with that as a background. And then we engage in better nutrition habits, and they see the difference. Like, oh my gosh, I get to eat so much food and I feel like a real human being again. And I'm actually not losing muscle and my metabolism isn't falling off the table. So you can see the longer I talk about this, I do show a little bit of my personal investment and, somewhat of an anger level, because this really is not a good thing to do. It's not healthy. It's not better by any metric whatsoever. And yet there are still people who make this the number one method in our country. Any given year, you look at the top 100 best-selling books on the market right now, I guarantee you about 10 of the 100 are nutrition books, and every single one of them are ketogenic books. Because it's just that allure, that promise of super, super fast weight loss, which, because of the amount of water loss generated by lower carbs initially, it always seems so great. It's like that first week, like, oh man, I remember that time I was on a low carb diet and I lost 7 pounds the first week. I got to do that again. This time I'll be better at it. And we never realize it's the diet that's failing us. We're not the ones failing. That's part of that sustainability in the equation. But I always tell people, look, you can look at the research, you can listen to opinions, try it yourself if you want. If you have to be the one that touches the hot stove to make sure it's hot, then feel free. I value experiential learning. Been there, done that. I'm telling you, you're gonna confirm the research that's already there. Anything, Kevin, that you think we should throw in here in the mix for you guys who are just joining us as guests? Dr. Kevin Brunacini has his doctorate as a nurse practitioner. He teaches in a university, as well as he is one of our coaches. And in my own work with general population clients, he and I co-coach. So he's kind of my wingman, and we're partners in doing this with a lot of people. So anything you want to throw in there, Kevin?
I've read the study. I've actually heard Kevin Hall present this in just a community, community forum here in the local area. And I think what astounds me most is just the drop in MET rate in 6 days is just staggering, because while that's bound to occur with any dieting process, to think that you could have 5%, if that's what the math was, in just 6 days, to me that's just so significant. That why would someone want to endure that if they don't have to? I mean, if the context is there for whatever reason, fine. But in a true general population sense, no client wants to ruin their metabolism for weight loss. And to me, it's reckless. And that's what's, just like I'm biased against, low carb keto approaches, but it's when it's to the point of taking advantage of vulnerable populations, that's where, from a medical aspect, that just, I'm not going to cross that line, and it should never happen with the patient or client. And yet it happens for a lot of reasons, but it's quite frustrating how people are taking advantage for that reason, even from legitimate clinicians. And that's probably even more frustrating from my perspective, that they should know better, and yet they just don't. They don't seem to care, or they're just, showing an obvious sign of lack of character or clinical integrity. But, I'll go off of my diatribe there, but I guess there's really nothing too much to say I just find the MET rate drop to be the most significant to me, because, it's everything else is nothing new to us necessarily in terms of the results, but it's nice to have affirmation of what we know to be supported by the body of evidence out there.
And this is truly just one study. I mean, Kevin Hall himself has been involved in hundreds of studies and has personally conducted, dozens and dozens and dozens. To the point of Amanda, who asked, well, maybe if you just had to lose quick weight, like you really just needed to lose some weight, would it be a better approach? And I would say yes, but depending on what kind of weight you want to lose, because again, remember, in just 6 days, the higher carb group lost twice as much body fat. So if you want to lose weight, as in extra water, like you just, for some reason, you think, instead of losing a total of 2 or 3 pounds with 1 pound of it being fat, if you want to lose 6 or 7 pounds in that first week and only half a pound of it being body fat, like for a surgery, like maybe you have to just reduce blood pressure for a surgery. And so you just need gross body weight loss. You don't mind that your metabolism's always already coming down. You don't mind that you lost half the body fat, then yes, a low carb diet would do that. But I would also say that just a lower calorie diet would do it even better. For example, if you go to the Mayo Clinic and you need some kind of an emergency surgery, and they think your current body weight is a risk, and they won't even do the surgery for 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. I've had orthopedic surgeons and neurosurgeons send me patients, and they'll walk in my door and say, Dr. So-and-so won't do my surgery until I lose 50 pounds. Dr. So-and-so won't do my surgery until I lose 100 pounds. And the Mayo Clinic has classified what's called a very low calorie diet as 500 calories a day. So, regardless of what kind of macronutrient distribution you want, if you want to lose weight quickly, just don't eat. Obviously, that's not, the safest, healthiest, best way for long-term sustainable weight loss or fat loss. But the lower you reduce your calories, you will lose even faster. Guests on this call won't know this, but we had a couple chats on our daily live supports about fasting and intermittent fasting. And I shared with the group that I've done a 7-day pure water fast where matter of fact, I lied to you guys, by the way. I need to clean this up. I need a confession time here. I was going to do 7 days, but I stopped it after 5 because I kind of had experienced what I wanted to experience. So I was going to do 7 days. After day 5, it was a Friday night. It was a beautiful summer day. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to break my 5-day water fast. I didn't have any juices or broths or anything else, just water for 5 days. And I had a piece of watermelon and then kind of eased into that. But in those 5 days, Amanda, I lost 14 pounds. So, obviously a ton of water, but also, when you're having 0 calories and you're probably still burning 2,000 a day, you're going to lose a lot of extra body fat as well. Looks like somebody put that study up there. Yes, it was 2015, Kevin Hall. He had, I believe, 16 other collaborators on this particular study done at the NIH. But yeah, I mean, if you guys are really interested in this, do a comparison. Look up in that study some of the studies that they cite, even the ones that don't necessarily support their conclusions, and then you can compare methodology, see how they conducted those studies differently. But on top of Amanda's question, I want to point out that not necessarily in terms of if you need to lose weight, not body fat, but just weight fast, would it be better to go low carb? And I agree with that to some degree. But there are times when a lower carb approach is helpful. And the gold standard right now, every single time somebody tells you that they love a low carb diet, like I'm married to this methodology, I'm keto all the way, they will justify it by saying, did you know that if somebody has grand mal seizures and they're an epileptic, that if they go on 0 carb diets, like it'll cure their epilepsy? And I'm like, yeah, I do know that. And guess what? 1% of the population has epilepsy. We don't govern all of human nutrition and physiology by 1% who has a massive, significant health disorder. All of proper nutrition in the entire compendium of research, we don't throw all of that out for one disease where 1% of the population has it. But it does show that for something that has massive implications with systemic inflammation, maybe just specific to the brain, thank goodness we found a cure for those people or something that really helps. Thank goodness we know that if they eat a certain way that is low carb, it improves their condition significantly. That's an amazing finding. That is fantastic for people who have epilepsy. Has nothing to do with normal nutrition. Similarly, as we've talked about with cancer prevention, After we chatted about this, Kevin sent me some links, and we had a discussion, and we talked about how cancer cells use sugar as energy. And so it's well thought that if you have cancer, you're in stage 3, stage 4 cancer, just drop sugar to nothing. Matter of fact, drop carbs to nothing. There have been research studies with stage 4 cancer patients that they do better on a ketogenic diet, not just low carb, but 0 carb diet. And if I had stage 4 cancer, I would look very seriously at that research. I would look at it like I've never looked at it before to say, is there something I can do to save my life or the life of a loved one? And if a ketogenic diet does it, again, fantastic. I would do that if the evidence is really there. Has nothing to do with normal nutrition. There's not a correlation directly to that, except there are certainly a lot of correlations to overfeeding in general. The fact that 70% of us are overweight or obese. Hey, Christian, good to see you. Love it when you pop your head in the door. But that overall systemic inflammation is a real problem. And it's not just carbs versus fat. It's eating too many calories. It's always being in a calorie surplus where we're gaining weight every year. Has a lot to do with saturated fat and processed carbs and refined sugar, not just carbs versus fat. That's an entirely different discussion. So when you hear these ketogenic proponents go right for the epilepsy card or the stage 4 cancer card, realize you're talking about disease processes that are incredibly specialized, and you would be silly to say that there is a direct correlation. Some overlapping corollaries in some places, but not a correlation. So any other questions? Let's see. Somebody said, I would love to share this with my keto friends. I'll consider that, Amanda. I'll set it to my video guy, and we'll see if we can clean it up a little bit and make it nice, and we can do that. But again, you guys would have to agree as well, because all of your names and pretty faces are on here, so that those would be shared. Wouldn't want to out somebody if you didn't want to be known to be inside of the Flexible Dieting Institute daily live support chat. And
Joe?
Yes, sir.
Hey, I have a friend just yesterday. His girlfriend had thyroid cancer, and she doesn't have a gallbladder. So keto with someone like that, because that's what she's doing.
Yeah, that's going to be misery. The gallbladder secretes bile into the small intestine to help emulsify that fat. And if you don't have a gallbladder and you're eating a high fat diet, you're going to be in a lot of pain and GI dysfunction. So, number one, I would present to her this kind of research showing, okay, let's first get calories down, make sure you're not gaining body fat, make sure you're not in a super anabolic state, because that's also one of the feeding mechanisms of cancer cells. But let's also just get rid of refined sugar and refined carbohydrates. But do you really think, an apple or some brown rice or some oatmeal, is going to impede cancer survival? That was one of Kevin's points when we talked about this. Is it's actually the fermentation process, which is another part of metabolism. So you've got the Krebs cycle, which deals with, turning glucose into water in ATP. And then we have fermentation. There are 2 or 3 different main ways that we can derive energy from food. But I would say, look, that's a tough trade. We definitely have to, reduce those lesser quality forms of carbs, but she's going to have to live with what her gallbladder can give her. Very, very unique, specialized instance there, but that would be my first look at it.
Thanks.
Brandon, you have a question?
Hey, yes. So both my parents, they're on the side of being diabetic, and a lot of them, they believe that the path of low carb, sort of a ketogenic approach is the best route for them. I asked them really, what's the reason for that, and the reason being is insulin sensitivity. And I mean, I for one tried keto at one point too, and I mean it was a worse experience. But a lot of people that I've seen that do that keto, and on behalf of my parents as well, I am aware, they don't keep track of their calories whatsoever. I mean, it's a portion of the eyes, I guess, what they do, and a lot of the times looking at the kind of foods that they're eating, it's high fat content, which it's not always restricting, the bad sorts of fats, all the saturated fats. How is it that someone could possibly correct that insulin sensitivity in a situation like that?
Okay, good question. And hope you're doing well down there in Texas. Tough times. I hear everything's getting better. One of our own program owners and coaches who lives in Houston, she had no power for 4 days, pipe broke, and the entire ceiling above her kitchen just caved in, and just a mess. But anyway, glad you're with us, Brandon. Really cool that you made it. So insulin sensitivity, we talked actually a lot about this in the last couple of days this week, and you have to realize that changes gradually. So nobody's going to go from being a type 2 diabetic or having, hypoglycemic episodes to all of a sudden eating perfectly well one day and it corrects everything. Those receptor sites, the receptor site degradation and the receptor site affinity, all of that changes gradually over time. It resensitizes. And so you have to ask people, okay, let's do what's best for your health. Let's make these changes. And if they're too aggressive, we can do it slowly. Let's monitor symptoms. If somebody like a nutrition consultant says you should have, this amount of protein, carbs, and fat, and this is the calorie level I think you should be at, there still has to be some flexibility. I mean, that's what flexible dieting is all about. And so that person, because of a condition like insulin sensitivity, may still feel hypoglycemic. And so they may have to have higher amounts of carbs some days versus others. And they've just got to be really sensitive to their own internal health and medical cues. But it doesn't change the fact that over time, it is the lower calories and just the improving health that's going to make that change. So to Dr. Hall's point, in this particular study, the higher carb group, their insulin levels didn't change, but it didn't matter. They still lost twice the body fat. They still, sustained their metabolic capacity. They still, were on track mathematically to maintain their lean body mass and their momentum. So all of those things point in the direction of sustainability, which is the single greatest thing. But Brandon, you bring up another point that I really like. They're not necessarily tracking their calorie intake. And that's a super attraction of ketogenic dieting. There are companies out there now using taglines like, oh, stop doing that silly, calorie counting stuff and weighing and measuring food. That's just stupid. Don't do that. All you have to do is avoid this entire food group, and only eat this and you'll be fine. And that's another, selling point, a marketing point for ketogenic dieting is you don't have to do anything except just eat fat all day. And it's, again, I mean, the data is there. So I would, if it were my family, first of all, that's a sensitive topic, how far you can push somebody, but I would just say, here's the data. I mean, these are the facts. You can believe them or not, but this is a well-researched topic. Any other questions before we leave? I can't believe it's already been 50 minutes. Really appreciate you guys coming in as guests. That's, makes me feel good that we're doing something worthwhile. Roseanne or Annalisa, you guys top tier coaches have anything?
Oh, I'm really grateful you brought this study up. I know you've talked about it in the past, but to have it explained really helps me out, especially with some of my clients who just kind of prefer higher fat diet, but isn't really necessarily making the losses that they want. So I may be having a conversation and just explaining this a bit more to them and letting them make a more informed decision.
Thanks, Roseanne. I appreciate that. Very, very good point.
I still want to put that challenge out. Bring another person each week, Friday.
Yeah. We'll keep pushing for that. Annalisa, were you going to say something?
Yes, thanks for the study. Is very, very interesting. And we also are seeing this in the field, on the field when we prep and coaches
our athletes.
clients, we notice that they obtain better results if we have more carbs and lower fat, even if calories are the same. They feel better, they train better, and they also get better results. So,
and more associated too.
Mm-hmm.
yes,
Absolutely. And that's an important part of study. Like it's, you can read these research reviews and studies from other people, but when you see it time after time after time, I mean, I have to say, out of all the things I've ever done, you know, my entire education plus my personal experience, I've learned more from working with thousands and thousands of clients over 25 years. I mean, those are a lot of individual studies I've done, you know, case studies one at a time. And you see the results over and over and over. Good point, Annalisa. I'll close this with this, guys, and it just to jump on Annalisa's point. I had one particular client who came to me who was a ketogenic dieter. This was a guy who was eating 200 grams of fat a day, no carbs, just enough carbs for, you know, GI motility. So in fibrous sources, so about 20-25 grams, like a salad or two a day, along with just 200 grams of fat. And he was, you know, to his credit, he was doing ketogenic dieting well. You know, it wasn't even like high protein. It was moderate protein. So it could be classified as purely keto. And he wanted me to help him get ready for a bodybuilding contest. And I said, I will, and I'm going to start out doing it your way, but I want you to at least be willing to experiment. And so I took him, you know, after a couple of weeks, kind of baselining him out, and we started adding a little bit of carb, replacing some, you know, and he was even doing it in what's a really traditional ketogenic way. He was getting all of this in 2 meals a day. So long story short, after 20 weeks of dieting, he went from 200 grams of fat a day as his intake down to about 50 or 60 grams. He was eating 20 grams of carbs. I had moved him all the way up to 400 grams of carbs a day. And he lost 20 pounds of body fat, regained 5 pounds of lean body mass. And you guys in physique sport know that when you're in a calorie deficit, you do not gain muscle. You don't gain muscle when you're in a calorie deficit. Ketogenic dieting is so bad, he regained 5 pounds, got shredded. He was, by the way, he was up to 4 meals a day, moved him from 2 meals a day to 4. And what that does, if you did the math, he lost that much body fat, and he was eating more calories at the end than where he started. That is just how flawed ketogenic dieting is on every level. When you go out, even from this study, which was a great study, over 6 days to 6 months, it just mathematically compounds in the favor of maintaining some carbs. And I have to say, just like my graphics, you know, stated, or at least my text in my posts that I announced this lecture, you know, it doesn't mean that you don't manage carbs. We still need to have a certain amount of overall calorie intake, and it means we have to have a certain amount of carbs. There's still an awareness and a metric to that. It doesn't mean that quality is just out the window. We still have health values and principles we want to live by. So it's not just eat sugar and bad carbs. It's carbs in a clinical sense versus fat, and, you know, ketogenic dieting, low carb dieting versus moderate to low fat dieting. But for you guys, I will post this. I know it's been posted here a couple times. I'll post the link to this again on my social media. So if you guys hit me on Facebook or Instagram at Joe Klemczewski, I'll have that there. But yeah, any other questions, feel free to follow up. We can continue this on through some social media. And for you guys who are our clients and coaches, we'll of course see you here every day, Monday through Friday. And if you guys are guests, you're certainly welcome to come back next Friday. We plan on keeping Fridays open like this, and you can tell friends and share that link. We don't mind. And I just want to say thanks for everybody's attention and great questions. This is really, really good discussion.